Good morning, good morning. All right, let's hop to it. We've got more of the world of the Jaredites. Last time, we were talking about the departure and how it was likely a climate catastrophe in Middle Asia of extremely strong winds that not only took down the Tower of Babel, but also likely drove the barges forward for the Jaredites. And that was way cool. Which is kind of funny because, like I said, there's a lot of anthropologists that sit there and think the ziggurats that were found in the Middle East were representative of things like that would become or be the Tower of Babel. And those stepped pyramids, I wish I knew more about them. Let me put it that way. I have a very rudimentary understanding, and it's like just a few sentences worth of information about them. So I am not some anthropologist, but I sit here and go, if those were supposed to be kind of what the Tower of Babel was supposed to be like, how would the wind take that down? I would think that it was that it was probably buried. On the other hand, if it wasn't just buried by the desert sands, it could be that it was taken down because there was no, just like the Indus Valley civilization or others, that along with the wind, there went the water, and when the water goes, nobody stays. So it very well could be that. Yeah, all we just know is that the tower was blown down. Whether that is literal, that it was like a very big tower and then literally toppled, which very well could be. I mean, there's a lot that seems to point to that. Or whether it was taken down or taken out because of the wind, which made everyone disperse, which made the towers stop, and then in just scavenging what they could, they would take the resources from the tower and that topples it. There's all sorts of ways you can interpret the fine details of it. But I think that's the interesting point, is that when you get down to a lot of fine points about the specific history or the specific doctrines, there's a lot that doesn't matter. You can have 15 working theories for this one point in the gospel, like the Tower of Babel, and still understand that the whole point is that this is the main things that they were doing, and this was the result thereof. And whether it was their languages were confounded because they dispersed, or whether their languages were being confounded first before they dispersed, or whether it was the tower was actually toppled over because of the wind, or that the tower was no longer being constructed and then deconstructed by scavengers because they were being dispersed. I mean, it's details like that it will be nice to know if we actually could ever find that. But in the meantime, the story, the main points of the story remain the same. The point is that they were trying to reach heaven without God. To me, that screams something of the temple. And it may not be, right? That may just be my personal kind of symbolism that I take. And so, in the end, sometimes it's important to take the meaning of the story to help advance what God is trying to say. And if you want to sweat the small stuff, go ahead, but recognize that you may not ever get the full answers in this life because there just may be no way to tell exactly what it is. So doing the best that you can in the most spiritual way that you can is probably the best answer. All right, the way out. From the plain of Shinar, the Jaredites moved northward into a valley named after Nimrod, the mighty hunter, and thence into that quarter where there never had man been. See Ether 2:5. This would take them into the land of great broad valleys, where the Tigris, Euphrates, Kura, the Aracas rivers have their headwaters, a hub of radiating valleys and routes to which the Euphrates owes its importance as a highway of commercial and military penetration. That comes from A. Morat, Histoire de l'Orient 1. Good references to old books that I have no clue of. The frequent occurrence of the name Nimrod in this area, which we have already noted, may not be without genuine significance, for no historical phenomenon has been more thoroughly demonstrated than the extreme tenacity of place names. In many instances, place names still in use among illiterate peasants or nomads have proved to go back to prehistoric times. Whether the party moved east or west from the Valley of Nimrod is not a major issue, though a number of things favor an eastern course. So if we're looking at Central Asia, like again, north of the Euphrates or such, or at least let's say it's the Tigris-Euphrates area, as he's speculating, if he goes to the east, that's going to take him to the east side of the Arabian Peninsula. But let's see what he continues to say. For one thing, there is a great length of the journey. For this many years we have been in the wilderness, Ether 3:3. Such a situation calls not only for vast expanses to wander in, but a terrain favorable to cattle-raising nomads, and a region in which there never had man been, conditions to which the Asiatic, rather than the European areas, conform. But I'm sorry, really? So here they are shortly after the flood, and so they're wandering in places that nobody had been before. He thinks it's best that they go east. He assumes that they go east because he thinks going west into the European areas, so this would be things like up into Turkey and Greece. I guess that makes sense. Like, you'd have to kind of go north, like where the 10 tribes were scattered was north, up into the Baltic states and up into Russia and such. So if all the 10 tribes scattered north into Ukraine, Russia, through Georgia, and the country Georgia, not the state Georgia, and the Baltic states like Yugoslavia, etc., and just up that way, that would make sense. But to get to Europe, you'd have to go north up into the kind of Russian area, then go west. You'd have to cross over the Ural Mountains, and so you'd be going to the Mediterranean. So, yeah, you got a bunch of obstacles. So I can see why he's suggesting that, all right, let's say you're in the Tigris and Euphrates area. You could go to the east. That would mean that you'd be going to things like the Indus Valley. Ooh, now let me pull up the world map. Now that I'm thinking about this, okay. So if you are in Euphrates River area, that's kind of Iraq, Syria currently. So north, so going west would take you kind of to the land of Israel and the Mediterranean and Egypt. If you go north, you have hills that take you into Turkey, and then again, still west is Mediterranean, Greece, all very Rocky Mountain. To go north from there, you have a bunch of Rocky Mountains. Armenia, Georgia, which the mountains to the north of Georgia are actually pretty steep. So being scattered further northward into the plains of places like Russia at this point, and then north and west from there, Ukraine, and then into Europe, takes a bit. Yeah. The Ural Mountains, where are those? I always expected them to be like around Poland, but I guess it's Slovakia, Romania, etc. Austria, just kind of a, huh? Yeah. Anyways, to overcome the mountains of Georgia would be quite a problem. But let's say you were in the valleys, kind of either of the Euphrates, etc. Going east, you could take to the Persian Gulf, which is the right side of the Arabian Peninsula, or, so here's what I'm looking at. Let me show you. It might be pretty boring, but this is the area which I'm looking at, okay? And so if you're at the northern parts of Syria and Iraq, going east would mean that you'd go through Iran, which is a whole bunch of mountains, and then some other plains. So it depends on how far you're going. There will be mountains, any which way you go from Syria and Iraq, right? Unless you're going through the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Gulf. Well, that's kind of weird then. So was the language, I think the language was being confounded beforehand, and that they were going to be dispersed. And so he's like, yeah, let's get you moving. So that's going to be several years before he gets to where he needs to be. Then the huge, large wind comes up, destroys the Tower of Babel, and then moves the barges on the water. But if you keep going east, you get Afghanistan, Pakistan. Pakistan has the Indus Valley. Then there's all of India. So it's like, how far is this going to go? Is this going to be in the Persian Arabian Gulf? Anyway, pure speculation. I have no idea. But let's see what Hugh Nibley has to say. Conditions to which the Asiatic, rather than the European areas, conform. But most revealing is the report that the wind never did cease to blow toward the promised land, while they were upon the waters, and thus they were driven forth before the wind. Now, whether the Jaredites sailed from the eastern and western shores, they would necessarily have to cross the ocean between the 13th and 16th parallels north, where the prevailing winds are westerly, right around the world, since the cause of these winds is tied up with the revolution of the Earth and the relevant coolness of polar regions. It may be so. He's saying they were driven forth from before the winds, 13th and 16th parallels north. Sorry, this is the way I learn. And I want to know specifically, global map with latitude marks. I know there's a way to do it on Google Maps, but I'm just a wee bit, really. I just want to see the image, thank you very much. So his 16th parallel. So this would be the same. So he's saying 16th to, sorry. He's saying oceans between the 30th and 16th. Wow, that's a pretty big chunk. So the 30th parallel, for example, on the Americas side is like Panhandle of Florida, and the very top of the Gulf of America, or the Gulf of Mexico, goes right through the middle of Texas and kind of through the top of western Mexico. So that's the 30th parallel. On the European side, that goes through northern Africa and right through the middle of Egypt, the northern part of Egypt. So he's saying between the 30th and the 16th parallel, which the 16th parallel would be kind of Caribbean and lower Yucatan Peninsula area, lower Caribbean, middle of Saharan Africa kind of thing, middle to lower part of India. So he says that they'd have to sail through that area, which is westerly. So westerly winds along that parallel, I would think that means that they would have been taken through, if it was a short journey, maybe through the Mediterranean, which is north of the parallels he's naming and going off the coast of Africa. On the other hand, if it was that their launching off point was the northern part of Africa, that would also, the most westerly part of Africa, places like Algeria, well, not Algeria, but Western Sahara, Morocco, that kind of thing. Which there's also a map online called Wind Map, or Earth Wind Map. But that actually shows the current conditions of the wind on the Earth today, not their prevailing winds. But yeah, if it was, we know that the Promised Land is going to be over here in Americas, because that's where the Nephites and Lamanites land and eventually find their stuff, as in the land of destruction, or land of desolation. Which, so I'm wondering if that means that there was some sort of hurricane or something off the front coast of Africa that took them across the Atlantic. But he's just saying it could be, whether it's east or west. Here in these parallels, it's westerly. So it may be assumed that our same winds prevailed in Jared's time as in ours. Of course, one cannot be too dogmatic on such a point, for weather has changed through the ages, and freak storms do occur, yet the extreme steadiness of the strong winds suggests prevailing westerlies and a North Pacific crossing. North Pacific crossing. So he thinks they went to the east. And then we're taken from there east again. Huh. Like, I get it. There's near the equator, it goes westerly, and then in the northern hemisphere, it'll come up and go to the east again. And so if you're following these currents and general wind-blowing maps, etc., if he launched off from someplace like China, it depends on the weather at the time, If it took him north in the Pacific crossing, okay. Or he could have taken the westerly one from Africa. But like he says, there's no way we can be that dogmatic because it just doesn't exactly tell us. But either way, he's just saying the steadiness points to the idea of continual light trade winds. A North Pacific crossing, since it would have meant a headwind all the way. Okay, so sorry. So yet the extreme steadiness of the wind strongly suggests prevailing westerlies, and a North Pacific crossing, since it would have meant a headwind all the way had the voyagers attempted the Atlantic. But what if they went off the front of Africa? What about the triangle trade winds, where you'd go from Africa to the southern part of America, up to northern America, back to England, and down again, and you just keep doing that? Anyway, well, I'm trying to recreate what he's specifically trying to say. So he thinks that it was a North Pacific crossing because you have wind currents that come because of near the equator, and then from China and such, the coast, it kind of just shoves it down to Thailand and stuff, at least on the current wind map that I have. But let's say that he was just maybe farther north, or there was something that brought them farther north, and so it brought them north and then to the east, so it's following the Arctic kind of winds that go up to Kamchatka, over across the Aleutian chain, and then down kind of the western side of the United States. That would make sense to me. So, but I don't understand why he says that it strongly suggests the prevailing westerlies and a North Pacific crossing, since it would have meant a headwind all the way had the voyagers attempted the... Why would there be a headwind at the Atlantic? That one I don't understand. Because like I said, if you are crossing from the front end of Africa, which is Morocco, and other such things, those winds will take you to the Caribbean. And if it just drives you continually up there, let's say there's a typhoon that they're in the front of and being pushed by, or a hurricane, right? There are hurricanes that go up to New York, for heaven's sake. So I don't understand the headwind for the Atlantic, other than he's thinking from going from Europe, such as England, over to America. Then you would have headwind, especially if you're doing a North Atlantic crossing. But I don't know. I'd have to talk to him about it and understand better. Because I would think the wind is they're very light barges, right? They're very high in the water. I doubt that they have rudder or deep keels, and so they don't have real ways of steering. They are just very tight, and that way these winds push them along together, and they'll be submerged in the water by those giant waves that are pushing them along. So I'd think between both the ocean currents and the wind that you would want to be going together with them. All right, anyways, you can enjoy looking at the Earth wind map online. You can enjoy, it has air currents, it has ocean currents, other things like that, and try and figure it out better than I can. But let's continue on and see what he has to say. So he says that a North Pacific crossing would be better, since it would have meant the headwind all the way had the voyagers attempted the Atlantic. The length of the sea journey, 344 days, tells us nothing, since the vessel, though driven before the wind, apparently did not use sails. The almost perpetual hurricane conditions would have made sails impossible, even if they had had them. But the fact that the party spent almost a year on the water, even with the winds behind them, certainly suggests the Pacific, and recalls many tales of Chinese junks that through the centuries have been driven helplessly before the winds to end up after a year or so at sea stranded on the beaches of our west coast. Then, too, we must not forget that a mountain of exceeding height stood near the point of Jaredite embarkation, and that there is no such mountain on the Atlantic seaboard of Europe as there are at many points on the Asiatic shore. What? Sorry, again, I am where is he drawing this? I'm really fascinated. So he's saying that there's some large mountain. Mount Fuji? Sorry. Some large mountain. Yeah, China is full of all sorts of lots of different terrain, so okay, sure. European coast? But what if it was like Morocco? Or heck, what if it was something like Liberia? Let's go south on the African plains and continents. Sierra Leone, Guinea, Gambia, all those countries. How mountainous is it for them? So, but I think one thing that would be the 344 days on the water, and nearly a year on the water, I think that does point to more of a Pacific crossing. And it is because of ocean currents and how long that they would take to get from one side to the other. That's a long time to be on the water. Now, the question is were they on the water the entire time? Don't know. See, I very much tend to think that the Nephites went around the south part of Africa and using the winds that come up from there that naturally would take them to the Florida area makes a lot of sense. The Jaredite one, because they have so much more time on the water, it really could be practically just, I would love to see, all right, ocean currents and waves and winds. Where would it be? Where would it be blowing? And unfortunately, we're not given directions because they didn't have the directions. I don't think they had a compass. I don't think they had anything like that. But he's pointing to there being a mountain from Ether 3:1. All right, so this is what's... Whew, I'm sorry, we are getting slowly through the book, but I am really trying to dig through what in the world that he's talking about to make sure I'm getting it properly. So Ether 3:1 says, "It came to pass the brother of Jared went forth unto the mount which he called Shelem." Oh, that's why. So he's saying he went into the mountain to converse with God, get the stones. That's where he has the vision of Jehovah and sees him before making the barges and going off. Interesting. That's a point. That's a good point. Okay. But east or west from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Gobi Desert and the border of Korea, to the lower Danube and the Carpathian Mountains, a single way of life has prevailed. So now he's switching gears to this entire region to then back up what's been going on. Okay. So, but east or west from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Gobi Desert and the border of Korea to the lower Danube and the Carpathian Mountains, a single way of life has prevailed since the dawn of history, conditioned by a remarkably uniform type of terrain. A number of authoritative studies in the so-called art of the steppes and the excavations of the Russians in recent years have confirmed the most extravagant speculations on the extent, antiquity, and uniformity of the steppe cultures. The newly discovered Celtaminarian culture, for example, would seem to bind together all the major languages of Europe. And hi, dearie.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Nice.
Anything I can help you with?
I just wanted to say hi.
Okay, well, hi.
By the way, you're doing great.
Good to know. So, the Celtaminarian culture, for example, would seem to bind together all the major languages of Europe and Central Asia in a single vast prehistoric continuum that embraces not only the Indo-European family, but the Turanian as well as the ancient non-Aryan languages of India. Asia is the classic land of wandering tribes and nations, with a common type of culture and society, which, as we shall see, is perfectly exemplified by the Jaredites. Only the Book of Ether sees the now dry and dusty landscapes under the peculiar conditions, and it came to pass that they did travel in the wilderness, and did build barges, in which they did cross many waters, being directed continually by the hand of the Lord. And the Lord would not suffer that they should stop beyond the sea in the wilderness, but would that they should come forth even unto the land of promise. Either 2, 6 through 7. The crossing of many waters under continual direction comes as a surprise, the sea in question being apparently but one, though a most formidable of many waters to be crossed. Now, it is a fact that in ancient times the plains of Asia were covered with many waters, which have now disappeared, but are recorded as existing well down into historic times. They were, of course, far more abundant in Jared's time, even as late as Herodotus. The land of the Scythians, the region to which Jared's people first advanced, presented formidable water barriers to migration. The face of the country now may have differed considerably from what it is now, says Brodnowski. The rivers were much deeper, and many lakes were still left from the glacial age, which later turned into swamps. Indeed, Pumpelly's theory of development of civilization from oasis cultures rests on the assumed existence of vast inland seas now vanished, but well attested even as late as the Chinese annals, which speak of extensive bodies of water which Lobnor and others, shrunken lakes and brackish tarns, are the withered survivals the steady and continual drying up of Asiatic heartland since the end of the last ice age is one of the basic facts of history, and is even looked upon by some experts as the mainspring of world history, but it is a relatively recent discovery. Whoever wrote the Book of Ether showed remarkable foresight in mentioning waters rather than deserts among the migrants' ways, for most of the deserts are of very recent origin, while nearly all the ancient waters have completely vanished. We need only remind ourselves that Sven Hedden had discovered that there are lakes which actually move in Central Asia. And he's citing the books he gets this from, which is Vernadsky's Ancient Russia. In there he has some information. It says, in the 12th century, it was possible to ward off invasion from it says ward of, but I think ward off invasion from Central Asiatic kingdoms of Khwarizm by flooding the country. Oh, interesting. Excavations of the Chinese Turkestan. Interesting. Okay. So next is chapter 3. So I keep staggering how fast I'm going on this. Sorry, this was a shorter amount of book, but a lot more of diving into the geography that he was talking about. Next is Jared on the Steppes, the moving host, and crossing the plains. I'm finding this absolutely fascinating. So he's making the argument that Jared and his brother went through the steppes of Asia and did a Pacific crossing. And I tend to agree with that only because of the 344 days on the water. I would think between the currents on the ocean and the winds prevailing, that it's likely that he did kind of a North Pacific crossing. Let's see here. Can I show that? Where are the currents? Currents. That is surface currents. No, that's, I want currents. Surface currents, I suppose. I want to do to ocean. All right. The reason I'm bringing this up, sorry, I don't want to look like I'm disappearing into this, but let's say he went off this is the wind map. This is called Earth, or you can put in Earth wind map, and it'll bring this up. And they have, when you click where it says Earth down there, you can change a bunch of settings. And this, I'm displaying ocean currents, okay? You can see that, especially down near the bottom part of the globe, trying to get it to stop, whatever. You can see right near the equator, it goes from east to west, and it's a very strong current because of the Coriolis effect. But then there's parts where it kind of comes up, and if you get the right part of China, you could start being pushed off to the northern selection to come over there. It seems to peter out north of kind of Hawaii, but there's still a general trend that would take you to the west coast of the Americas. And then from the west coast especially, the currents start to take you down from there. So again, if you have a Mesoamerican model in your mind, you're thinking that they would have done a northern Pacific arc, probably down the west coast, to then reach down to where the Mesoamerican area is, whether that's Mexico or the Yucatan Peninsula, etc. On the other hand, if you have a model of let's well, let's say they went off the Arabian Peninsula, depending on the time of the year, it could take you east or west. And that's why in the springtime, if I suspect the Nephites, so I know I'm changing gears, if the Nephites went from the Arabian Peninsula during the spring, they would have gone west, so down the coast of Africa and up the coast of Africa. And then with the storm, they'd be taken over. Because remember that hurricanes that hit America and the Caribbean start off the front of Africa. And so I think that that's the way that the Nephites went. I think it makes a heck of a lot more sense because they could take a regular ship. They knew ships and shipbuilding because, again, their family were traders. They'd been in Jerusalem. Jerusalem isn't exactly too far from the sea. And during 600 BC, there would have been a lot of different ships, a lot of different trade all over the world at that point. Now, for the Jaredites here, that's the interesting thing. So he is speculating that they went through the steppes of Asia and the plains there. And so that means it would have been, let's say they went through Iran and Turkmenistan, etc. Kind of through this area. And then onto the steppes of, which would be kind of the Tibet, Mongolia, etc. through China. So more like that. And continuing on from there. That's, okay, a lot of wandering, especially over land, that would have taken a long time. And other things like that. On the other hand, I sit there and think, what if he just had I don't know. Yeah, that's just hard to say. I really don't know. This is one that is much more, there's a less to go on, just because it's like, hey, wind came, took down, well, languages were being confounded. Then they were told that they were going to be dispersed, so they left. I'm assuming that it's in this pattern. And that later on, the same winds that took down the Tower of Babel is probably what drove the Jaredites. That may not be true, but it would make a lot of sense because they would have mountainous waves plunging them under the sea. That's pretty huge. I don't know. There's a lot more on this one that I have less speculation on, just because there's so many things that you can just rearrange or put to. Now, Hugh Nibley is going to make really good arguments for, in a similar vein as what he did with Lehi in the desert. But the one thing that I know, the currents for 344 days, Pacific travel, I believe someone did some sort of study with the currents, like dropping, almost like they were dropping bottles in the messages in a bottle along the Pacific currents to see how far and where they land, etc. And for 344 days, they did reach America, that kind of stuff. I'm butchering that completely. That is not exactly what they were doing, but it was akin to the idea of let's study ocean currents by seeing where beacons go and how far it takes and how long it takes, etc. Okay, that's the basics of it, and I believe that it went 344 days across the ocean. So, I can absolutely see a Pacific crossing for the Jaredites. And I'll just leave it with that. Because I just don't have anything that shows that it could have been otherwise. At the same time, it could be that perhaps they also followed the Nephite way, that they went around Africa, that the currents and winds just took them from the Arabian Peninsula and just did this whole thing. I don't know. I have no idea. But I think it'll be more fascinating when he gets into, here are the other chapter headings. For example, next in chapter 3, we're going to have the moving host, the concerning desert, the early Asiatic and Jaredite civilization, a general view, Jaredite culture of splendor and shame, the world of jails, the Salome episode, steel, glass, and silk, the animal kingdom. So I think he's going to compare, like, when the Jaredites got over here, how they kept capturing each other back and forth, and how that compares to the steppes culture. Which, that, I think, will be really kind of cool and show where this culture comes from that they did. So there you go. I look forward to the rest of this. I look forward to getting to understand the culture of the Jaredites more and how it has a corollary in the modern day. So I appreciate you sticking with me and all my bumbling around in maps and trying to figure out his arguments. I hope it made things a little more clear for you, like it did for me. I would think that there's a lot more wiggle room in which way they could have gone. I tend to favor the Pacific crossing because of the time that it took on the water. But it could be either. I don't mind either way. In the end, I hope this helps you explore more deeply the scriptures so that you can enjoy the ideas more. And if anything, I hope it sparks your imagination. So even if it seems all confusing and whatever else, or just a bunch of wasted time, that it helps you appreciate how God's hand takes people who do not have all the skills and gives them the skills that they need through the experiences that they have. Whether it was a desert-dwelling Nephi who knew how to caravan but had no clue how to make a ship, but was given the thoughts, ideas, and ways to do it, or the Jaredites, the same type of thing, that they learned how to make submersible wooden vehicles, which is way cool. The Lord helps those he needs to have in the right place. I just had a really cool video pointed out, short video on YouTube, that told that President Oaks, when he was first called to be an apostle, he was not a general authority beforehand. He went straight from being something like a gospel doctrine teacher to being called as an apostle. I mean, it helps that I'm sure that he was a Supreme Court Justice of Utah, so he shows that he could handle himself in all sorts of specific pressure and situations and things like that. But I think it's important to know that the Lord will always make sure and help you grow in whatever calling he gives you. And that our purpose is to do our best. And as we try to do our best, he will fulfill the rest of what he needs. Because it's his work. It's like most of the people, I think it was a general conference talk. They asked, why do people join the church? And it's like, the missionaries were not very good at explaining the gospel, and they were not good at explaining the Book of Mormon. But the absolute feeling of peace and the Spirit of God coming from both the missionaries and when they prayed about the Book of Mormon helped them know that it was true. And I thought, wow, that is really fantastic knowledge, that despite everything that we do, despite all that we can do, God still reaches out and saves his children, because we sometimes screw up terribly. But I do hope that those who convert to the Church of Jesus Christ stay, because they have that experience and then further enrich their knowledge. And that way, those little questions get answered, even if it's just on the back of their mind, sitting on the back burner. I hope that when people stumble across these answers and stumble across this information, it strengthens their testimony, going, yep, knew it all along. So, may God be with you. Have a great day.